What do you think of when you hear the word animation? For many, it might conjure up the image of old Disney or Saturday morning cartoons, or the greatest cinematic achievement of all time, Scooby-Doo and the Alien Invaders. But for a lot of people in the modern world, first thing to come to mind is anime. Whether it be insert anime example here, or the fantastically enjoyable insert anime example here. I do apologize, I literally know nothing about anime. Because these days, every group has that one anime kid. And if your group doesn't have one, it's because it's you. Despite the cultural zeitgeist of anime hate, fans tend to often hide their enjoyment. But this sentiment isn't true when it comes to movies. Now, technically, anime only refers to the serialized television shows, as far as I know, and films animated in Japan in this similar style aren't technically anime. That being said, they still receive the label and the connotation that comes with it. Despite that, one animation house has managed to break free into the mainstream and into the hearts and minds of people everywhere. That animation house is Studio Ghibli. Whether you're that one anime friend, or relatively oblivious such as myself, you've surely heard of Spirited Away, Grave of the Fireflies, and My Neighbour Totoro. In my 8th grade English class, we even watched snippets of Totoro for some reason, I think. With such a famous reputation, I was surprised, besides parts of Totoro, I had never seen anything from the studio. And with films such as Spirited Away always popping up on animation best lists and sometimes even greatest films of all time, I thought it was time I investigated for myself what makes this studio so special. So about a year ago, I began to plow through the catalog of the studio, which contains 22 features and 3 films that are highly connected, but not directly falling under the name. That being said, I will be including Nausicaa in this list, but excluding The Red Turtle and Castle of Cagliostro. However, I highly recommend you watch both of these, because they're great. So, with my repertoire complete, it is time to give you a ranking of 23 films from worst to best, as subjectively as possible. And just to mention, there might be some minor spoilers ahead for the films, so be warned. Starting with Earwig and the Witch. Ghibli's latest film came out in 2014, so many were excited to hear they would be releasing something in 2020, and it was going to be the first Ghibli film to be animated with CGI by the founder's own son, Goro Miyazaki. And then unfortunately, what we got was a half-baked Ghibli and Pixar project that rehashed ideas in considerably worse ways. It's not actually Pixar, I'm just saying that's what it reminds me of. That's not to say Earwig doesn't have any merits, though. If one can overlook the mostly atrocious CGI, which actually does work in some spots, then the story offers a comforting and relatable experience with some whimsical wonder added. Again, though, even this falls a little flat. I blame this aspect mostly on the source material and its lack of scope or general interest in the story. The scene in the graveyard near the beginning is really cute and interesting. It's a good way to knock the film off in a good direction, and there are a few other enjoyable moments throughout, like the band performance. However, as a whole, Earwig fails to live up to the studio's reputation. It feels like a rushed last-minute entrance into a competition that ended some 20 years ago with Toy Story. When Marnie was there. Are you noticing a pattern? The second newest of the Ghibli slate is another unfortunate disappointment. This time the animation does elevate the overall mediocre film. Main problem is an inconsistent tone and lack of likable or even fleshed out characters. Film places contrived twists over actual intriguing plot developments. That's not to say it's entirely bad though. In fact, the atmosphere of the world and stunning landscape animation do make up for a lot. Characters simply ruin this film, though, with their hyperbolic and one-note writing. That all being said, unlike Earwig, I can understand why someone might really like this one, and could even consider it a favorite of theirs, because it does have a more saccharine core that might appeal to one with a softer heart. Ocean Waves. This is a little unfair, considering this was made for television on a shoestring budget, mostly new and inexperienced animators at the helm. It's also at a disadvantage because so many other Ghibli films have explored a similar premise with much more experience behind the film. The story is a simple one. A boy sees a girl at a train station, and this causes memories of his high school life to return to him. Sounds interesting? I thought so too. It's a shame this film doesn't stick the landing, because there's so much good embedded within. There are many Ozuian shots, especially when the bottle is placed down and we turn focus to that, and there are great moments scattered throughout. There is a real subtlety to the pacing and score that I rarely see in other Ghibli films. All the characters feel real, even when they overact, because that's how people are in real life. At the end of the day, the film's highlights are also kind of its downfall. The slow pace really drags out the story, making an incredibly short film feel unbearably long at certain points. There's also a silliness to some of the dialogue that feels genuine enough, but still creates this awkward kind of dissonance. It's by no means a bad project, but there are subsequent projects that explore similar topics such as growing up, nostalgia, young love, coming of age, memory, in a much more confident and refined way. Only Yesterday. Isao Takahata is often called the other master, being the co-founder of the studio alongside Hayao Miyazaki and producer Toshio Suzuki. And besides him constantly working with themes and ideas I find absolutely fascinating, many of his films fail to really connect with me. Thus we find ourselves at Only Yesterday. Only Yesterday is a film that did ocean waves before ocean waves even existed. It's slow-paced, it explores the past and relation of time through our relationships with ourselves and others. It features moments of animated beauty that might stand out as some of the studio's finest work, and at points it's incredibly boring. Now, I love a slow-paced film, but I have to have a sense that the story is going somewhere, or something interesting has to constantly be happening. Somehow, Only Yesterday manages to be more boring than a Bela Tarr film. Despite this pace problem, there are moments of greatness that shine through. Early on in the Bass, we get a sense of memory and how the world of a child might actually work. The difference of memory and reality is interestingly portrayed through the color palette. There is some fun chemistry at times between Takeo and Toshi. Then there are moments in this film that really think they're endearing, but are just kind of strange and awkward. I'm talking about the menstruation stuff mostly. Yeah, you heard me right. The free-range dream sequences predicted later Takahata efforts like the Yamadas and Kaguya, but fail to really live up to the brilliance that we would later see. Nevertheless, there is a lot to love. Tales from Earthsea. Many are likely screaming that this is snuck above the number 23 position. Fact is, I'm a sucker for high fantasy, and something else that will be brought up later on down the list. Goro Miyazaki's debut directorial effort is a fairly straightforward and not terribly well realized adaptation of Ursula Le Guin's fantasy series. Within the film, the vistas are absolutely stunning. There is a sense of strange ambiguity in the characters, and much more to unpack for each individual viewer. Not to mention the brilliant score from someone besides Joe Hisaishi. This time it's Tamiya Tereshima, and he does a great job. The problem comes in the film's construction mainly. During the first half, I found myself thinking the film should either be a series or significantly longer than it is. That sentiment was completely reversed in the second half as everything began to slowly fall apart. There is undeniably a good base here, with moments of true brilliance scattered without. Unfortunately, the script didn't know how to handle the Earthsea story, and it crumbled under the weight. Luckily, the visuals attempt to make up for this, and Port Town is absolutely fantastic. Also, why so little sea in Earthsea? Have you read The Farthest Shore? The Borrowers. Some might know this as Arrietty. Another strange occurrence here, but I remember bits and pieces of this movie, and I might have even watched this also in 8th grade. Or that's just a mystical fever dream. The answer might be that I actually read the Borrower's book around this time. But anyways, back to the feature. As always, the animation here is absolutely gorgeous, especially the unique color palette and stunning painted backgrounds throughout. This is one of the newer films in the studio's catalog, and I can see how they have stepped up the animation. The story itself is fairly simple coming-of-age tale with an interesting little twist to it. All the characters, specifically Arrietty and Sho, are well developed and follow a predictable but satisfying arc. Despite being a really well-made piece with a unique story, it suffers from the same problem as Earwig. The world presented feels like it should be so much bigger than it is. but the bulk of the film takes place in just a single location. What this film does better than Earwig is reimagine that location in a lot of creative ways. Because of the character's size, an ordinary house can now become an expansive world filled with mystery, danger, and wonder around every corner. Like climbing up a massive bed, which seems so ordinary to us. This is probably the first film on the list I would actually recommend to others, so that alone should speak to the quality of this picture. My Neighbours the Yamadas. This film is essentially a comic strip. With that in mind, you can gauge your own entertainment. From my understanding, Yamadas was based on a newspaper cartoon series akin to something like Heathcliff or Calvin and Hobbes. Because of that, the movie is much more concerned with building characters and almost sitcom situations rather than streamlined plot. With this structure, we get a handful of really great moments, such as a sea metaphor sequence, or everyone chasing Noboru because his comment about owning the house. The sense of wonder that has begun to appear in the films of this list continues in a big way with this one. Despite no through storyline, Yamadas manages to portray life as it is in a fun and relatable way, with realistic yet perfectly cartoony characters. Though there are moments of thematic brilliance, the film is mostly one you can enjoy without paying too much attention to. I also do appreciate the changed art style. From Up on Poppy Hill. The final Goro Miyazaki entry on this list, though I think Goro gets a little too much hate, it is all deserved when one watches Ranya. This is not the case for Up on Poppy Hill. Another classic coming-of-age tale from Ghibli, this one follows Yumi, as she becomes involved with the school's newspaper boy, Shun. As we have come to expect from Goro, this film is filled with stunning landscape shots, beautifully rendered by the animation. The story itself might seem a little silly and simple at first glance, but there's a lot of depth and darkness buried beneath the surface. Many people will likely have the problem with the fake twist of the film. Although it really isn't needed, it does help to build a deeper connection between the characters and even expand the world in a meaningful way. This is a period piece that lacks all the magic Ghibli is so well known for, which might explain the lack of interest from mainstream audiences, but I believe this is one of the better films of this kind. It takes lessons from Ocean Waves and other less effective coming-of-age stories in the catalog and puts together the pieces that work well. If you do have an aversion to young romance storylines, then there are better films on this list, so maybe pass on this one. Grave of the Fireflies. Here comes the subversion I'm so well known for. Similar to pretty much every entry in the studio's lineup, there is a lot of beautiful animation. This is another effort from Takahata, so it should come as no surprise that this film is incredibly slow-paced and very deliberate in what it is trying to do. As with the rest of these, there are a great handful of moments and strong symbolic implications, as well as an incredibly important story about the consequences of war. I once heard someone call this feature emotionally manipulative, and unfortunately I'd have to agree. Plenty will find this film cathartic or devastating, but I find it to be mostly weightless. The emotion comes from consequences of the story, which would be fine if the catalyst wasn't contrived. Characters seem to change whenever an emotional beat is necessary, which makes you care for them less whenever something of consequence happens. I don't want to get into too much detail, but the story is a little sloppy and underdeveloped with the subtext and deeper implications. It's also kind of misery porn, which really only serves to highlight the anti-war message, but that's not necessary, as we'll see later on in this list. It's a shame because this film will likely always be crushed under the weight of its own reputation, because people love this movie. Which is fine. I think it is decent. The Cat Returns. It's fitting these two would be back-to-back because they are on opposite ends of the spectrum. Whereas Fireflies is Ghibli's most miserable, sad, and endlessly hopeless film, this is likely the most carefree, borderline stupid, and low-stakes endeavor the studio has ever undertaken. Although it's definitely fueling someone's furry fetish, which makes me a little uncomfortable. However, the story is silly and fun. Despite only 75-minute runtime, I do feel you could cut out maybe 10 minutes of that. Luckily, the rest of the film is so mind-numbingly enjoyable that my brain was completely fried by that point. Baron is a fun little character to follow, as is Yuki, which makes up for the weakness of Haru at times. This certainly is the most pandering and shallow entry from the studio, with no real thematic substance to offer, but it's so briskly paced and strangely imaginative, it's hard not to enjoy the hour or so that it runs. Pom Poko. Here's the premise. A bunch of shape-shifting raccoons with inflatable testicles wage war on humans attempting to destroy a forest near Tokyo. Now, there's a lot more to this film than my hyperbolic description, but if this does sound at least a little interesting, it is. Pom Poko is probably the most fast-paced of Takahata's work, perhaps in part because it was co-written by Miyazaki. The film is never dull and managed to keep you engaged with the struggles of these raccoons. You feel the love and loss that Shojiki experiences throughout the epic story. Again, the animation is a standout, with the Operation Poltergeist section really taking full use of the medium. My only real problem with the film comes with the narration, which feels unnecessary but not distracting enough to really ruin the experience. If you are looking for an unbelievably imaginative film that also addresses the common Ghibli theme of environmentalism, then this is a hard experience to beat. Ponyo. The first Miyazaki of the ranking. I know a lot of people that really dislike this film, but I think they tend to exaggerate or misunderstand the purpose. Ponyo, as you may know, was inspired by The Little Mermaid, and unlike other Ghibli movies, it is intentionally made for children. It is unapologetically a children's movie, and that's the point. I've also heard a lot of people complain about the animation, but I think it looks spectacular. It is certainly more simple than other animated films, but that also plays to the childlike aesthetic and sense of wonder that the film is aiming to create. The other plus this one has is one of my personal soft spots, the seaside setting. Remember that thing I said I'd mention later? Everyone knows I'm a sucker for the ocean as it is depicted in film. Set your film by the sea and I pretty much immediately give it a 10 out of 10. Ponyo is filled with cute moments meant to reflect the psyche of a child in authentic ways. And it's really pretty good. This movie was made for children. Stop treating it like it needs to be sallow to be of any quality. This is also the first time I'll mention dubs. The dub for this film is serviceable, but Liam Neeson really pulls the whole thing down. I'd recommend the original. Similar to The Cat Returns, Ponyo is probably one of the least substantive films on this list, but it nevertheless is enjoyable and full of wonder. Laputa, Castle in the Sky. In a technical timeline sense, this is the first film to be made under the Ghibli logo. And it is a great place to start because it sets up many of the themes, motifs, styles, characters, settings, and tones that permeate the studios, and specifically Miyazaki's work. It feels redundant at this point to say the visuals are stunning because, of course, they are. This is another adventure film aimed more towards children, but unlike Ponyo, there are some adult themes present. The sequence with the robot destroying army headquarters in particular comes off as very dark and mature. Historically, this film also helped to found the steampunk aesthetic and laid the groundwork for many other formative works in Japan and around the world, or so I'm told. This is also the first time I'd recommend against the dub version in full force. Ghibli is pretty well known for great dubs, but this is one where the original is very clearly better. I don't have too much else to say because everything else the film establishes gets built upon in the future in a lot of more interesting ways. Also, this is the first mind-blowing Hisaishi score on this list, just adding to the film's subtle beauty. Anyway, watch it, it's great, on to the top 10. We've made it to the top 10, so let's see what great films made the cut, starting with this, Porco Rosso. Ghibli's plots always feel a little bit like a fever dream pitch meeting, and this is no different. To make a film about an Italian fighter pilot cursed to live as a pig during World War II in what is often called a children's movie is just such a bizarre course of action. Luckily, it works really well. The sequence in this film with the fighter pilot ascending into heaven is one of the greatest of any film on this list. Marco is a bit of a flawed character when it comes to his treatment of others and general disinterest, but you can tell there's good intentions deep within him. Also, remember what I said about the seafront setting? Well, Miyazaki must agree with me because he sure uses it a lot. The Adriatic Sea as a setting feels so warm and comforting in this film, and this film can be very serious and dark at times, so I think that's a good contrast. Exploring the consequences of a warring state and the falling of a fascist government is also pretty bold. This is the first plane-centric movie of Miyazaki's, and you can tell that he is fascinated by this craft. Often, the detail put in the planes and air battles is a lot more than that put into the characters or story. But for this film, it works. Porco looks at the ideas of memory, war, personal, and national identity in a way that is mature compared to other films. There's a lot of heart also buried in underneath everything, which elevates it far above others on this list that have attempted to explore the same ideas. Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. This is the first certified Dylan favorite on the ranking, and for good reason. Though technically a pre-Ghibli feature, this second film from Miyazaki was largely the launching ground for the studio. Have you ever seen the Ralph Bakshi film Wizards? That's a film I dearly love, and for some reason it stylistically reminds me of some of Nausicaa. You see, this film is very much a style of the 70s fantasy, specifically something like Bakshi's own Lord of the Rings. There's just a level of grime and pessimism to the world. The people are terrible, and they will continue to be so until the end of time. Sure, there are good people, but everyone has the capability to do evil things, even if it is for a good cause. The world of Nausicaa is apocalyptic, not just metaphorically like a Bela Tarr production. Hey, wait a minute, this is the second time I've mentioned Tar in this video. Sorry. But literally apocalyptic. There's a sea of decay where nuclear fallout and warfare has led to an uninhabitable world for humans. And now, not learning from their mistakes, humans once again begin to fight against themselves and nature around them. This is a pretty fundamental idea for Miyazaki, the ideas of war and nature becoming so entangled. It's arguably the connective tissue of all of his works. That's what makes Nausicaa so interesting. It's a prototype for almost every other Miyazaki film we would see. War leading to unintended consequences, even if it is for a justifiable reason. We see that in Porco Rosso, Mononoke, Castle in the Sky, and The Wind Rises. The importance of Earth and how it should be respected by all humans, that shows up in Totoro, Ponyo, and Spirited Away. The need to be optimistic, even in the face of dire situations or worlds, well, that's pretty much the crux of Kiki's. Nausicaa might not be the perfect execution of all these ideas, but it is certainly the progenitor, and it's a great example of what the studio was capable, even in its infancy. But now, moving on to the giants. Spirited Away. What? How could you? You all yell at me. What's wrong? Is little baby gonna cry because I didn't put Spirited Away at number 1? The fact is, this film is really good. Perhaps the most detailed animation from the studio. Though I'd argue Howl holds that title. Spirited Away brings in everything you loved before, and then some. Quick side note, did you know this is the 10th highest rated film on Letterboxd? That's fine, I like it more than 12 Angry Men. The truth is, Spirited Away is the studio at its most imaginative. Every character, environment, and situation are fully unique and fully realized pieces of folk fantasy that manage to blend together in this universally relatable coming-of-age tale following a strong young female protagonist. Despite the near technical perfection, I do fault the movie in a few spots. Nothing truly damning, though. It does feature one of the greatest sequences, in which Chihiro takes the train across the sea with the ghost, and we get one of Hisashi's best pieces, One Summer Day. This is just a fully realized vision of childhood and growing up, mixed with a brilliantly thought-out spirit world thrown into the mix. I do find some of the dialogue to be contrite and overly silly at times, but that's fine because it's the perspective of a child. All I will say is the last 25 minutes or so are almost absolute perfection, though the whole river spirit thing has left me a little cold in the past, which might be why the film has moved down a little bit in this ranking. Thematically, I'd also like to say this film is overly simple at times. It's not a wholly bad thing, and in fact it works really well in the film, but I feel every animated feature explores growing up, falling in love, in a platonic way, and becoming the person you're meant to be, so it's a little tiring at this point. That being said, this might be the film that explores those themes the absolute best, so there's really not a whole lot of reason to hold a grudge. Really, just go watch this if you haven't seen it. Howl's Moving Castle. Howl is a lot like Spirited Away if it addressed much more complicated themes. Howl also seems to be much more you either love it or hate it kind of film. I don't really understand this sentiment because everything here is great. The high fantasy setting, pulled from the book by the author who also wrote Earwig, is absolutely stunning and fully imaginative. This film, without a doubt, contains the height of Ghibli animation in the stunning detail and endless beauty in the compositions. The story explores parallels with the Iraq War and analyzes all wars through a heavily critical lens, claiming really that all war is pointless. The story also addresses totalitarian states and the power of thought propaganda. Yeah, this is supposed to be a children's movie, right? Well, then there's this really comforting and brilliant love story that runs through the whole thing. It's also one of the funniest Ghibli movies, with Calcifer providing much of the comedic relief. The film dives into the idea of a constructed family. That's the family you create with people surrounding you is much more important than the family you are given. It's much more important to make something of what you have than complain about what you don't. It's an odd film, but arguably the most beautiful and arguably the most thematically deep. The landscapes and interiors are also so completely unmatched. Seriously, just look at Howl's room. That's so much work right there. And like a broken record, Joe Hisaishi provides some of the best musical accompaniment to any film project, really ever, whether live action or animation. In fact, it's fair to assume from this point going forward that without saying it, Hisaishi's score pretty much improved the films exponentially. I'm gonna get so many copyright claims for this video. My Neighbour Totoro. I think by now this needs very little introduction. The mascot of Ghibli is also its crowning achievement in many ways. The brilliance of this film is ingrained within its very construction. It is without any real conflict. It is without any real stakes. The film is without an antagonist. It is arguably without any real plot. It is the purest slice of life and simultaneously one of the most fantastical and imaginative films in the catalog. It's a contradiction. And it's true, Totoro is more than just a Funko Pop. That's not to say the film lacks thematics, because it is very rich with themes and mythology and runaway ideas. Miyazaki's trademarks are all here. Humans should be one with nature and learn the beauty that surrounds them every day. People should live in the moment and be happy because you never know what might come next in life. And something about a cat bus? I don't really know. Someone once described this film as a distillation of happiness, and it's hard to really argue with that. Why does this work so well? One word for you. Cat bus. Entering the top 5, we're greeted by the last entry in Miyazaki's filmography, The Wind Rises. I'd argue this is the boldest film Ghibli has ever made. Telling the story of Jiro Horikoshi, Miyazaki gets to reimagine all the themes that made his films classic in the first place. The horror and inevitability of war, the power of dreams, the fading of young love, all in a 2-hour biopic about Japan's greatest plane engineer. So much of this film works. Miyazaki takes his often overly imaginative style and applies it to a cruel reality of the world. He must also have known I love upper censor, because he busts out that die and wife trope like it's no one's business. Simultaneously a biopic and a love story, mixed with a healthy dose of heart-wrenching tragedy, The Wind Rises truly is an apt swan song. The dreams with the Italian engineer are also an incredible addition. Not gonna lie, boys, I was pretty teary-eyed, and then the film went, aight, it's over. Whisper of the Heart. Do you like country roads? Well, you better. This is the closest Ghibli has ever gotten to making an Ozu film. The story itself is fairly simple teen romance, but there's so much going on beneath the surface. The shot composition reflects the central framing and pillow shot construction of an Ozu film, giving it a lot more weight. The story itself also tells the progression of an artistic process. Shizuku, aside from slowly and unknowingly falling in love with Seiji, also dreams of becoming a writer. And the film follows her slow process of writing a novel and refining her skills while also setting realistic goals and expectations for the future. It sounds kind of like a weird indie film. Well, it kind of is. The idea of following a dream and refining the artistic process is also showcased in Seiji's story as he hones his skills in playing the violin and hopes to go to Italy to study violin making. This is also where Baron from The Cat Returns comes from, so there's this weird little connection that neither strengthens nor takes away from the film. It's really just a film about friendship and optimism, and how a healthy relationship involves two individuals encouraging each other to follow their dreams and be successful in life. It's a stunning portrait of optimism in an exceedingly pessimistic world, and a much better version of Up on Poppy Hill. Also, this is another time I'd say not to watch the dub. In this case, the translation is missing some of the elements that really elevate the story. However, the performances are all really good. The Tale of Princess Kaguya. Let's start by saying this would likely be my pick for the greatest animated film of all time. I really mean that. Nothing is quite like the brilliance of Princess Kaguya. The film itself is a retelling of one of Japan's most famous folk stories, that of the bamboo cutter and the moon princess. What really elevates this are the small changes made to the story and the absolutely breathtaking animation directed by Isao Takahata. The story itself explores so much in its 2-hour runtime. What it means to be human, the importance of both pain and pleasure in life, the defiance against destiny, the importance of memory, and an overall nostalgic vibe, simultaneously mixed with some of the best animation ever. The story manages to explore every aspect of the human existence through the eyes of someone who is completely ignorant to it. As always, Isaishi brings his A game, with Procession of the Celestial Beings being a real standout. The sequence which features Little Bamboo running out of the castle into the snow contains a brilliant decomposition of animation, as the stunning watercolors and charcoal fade into nothing more than real harsh line work to reflect the emotional tension and fast pace of the scene. My only problems are really minor, but they do still exist, so I'd like to go into them. The narrator, I feel, is a little unnecessary for the film because so much of it is conveyed brilliantly through visual means. The film is also 137 minutes long, and it probably could remove 5 or 10 of those. Luckily, the emotional weight and beautiful animation managed to make up for this. Also, if you happen to watch the dub version, it's hard not to appreciate Chloe Grace Moretz and her voice fitting Little Bamboo perfectly. The soft mixes really well with these pastel visuals. Not much else to say. This is what Takahata was aiming for with the Yamadas animation-wise, but it took him nearly 20 years to truly master the medium, and I am very glad he did. It's time for a certified gold classic. Kiki's Delivery Service. In the second lowest stakes film of all time, a young witch moves to a town by the ocean, or a town with an ocean view. You know what I'm saying, nudge nudge. There she starts delivering goods for a bakery to make money, becomes incredibly depressed, and then manages to overcome her problems by noticing the beauty in the world, making new friends, and learning a new perspective. Despite the fantastical elements, this just might be the most grounded work from Ghibli. It features things everyone, or at least most people, will experience in their lives. Moving to a new place away from home, becoming isolated in a new town, struggling to maintain a work-life balance that is healthy for you, losing interest in the things you love, feeling your friends aren't there for you, becoming an entrepreneur and struggling in a complicated economy, and, of course, learning to overcome all these things and live your life as you should. There's also an omnipresent Ghibli trope of coming of age, and a form of platonic young love. Guess what? There's also a seafront setting. The colors and animation also might be my favorite of any of these films. I'm just really a sucker for old 2D cell animation with that very slightly grimy look. The score, as I'm sure I will have to mention, is maybe one of the best by Hisaishi's, including Town with an Ocean View, which is the real standout. Then there's Gigi. Here's another time where I'd recommend the English dub, precisely for one reason, and that is Phil Hartman as Gigi. The original version is good, but Hartman just brings so much to the character that was a little flat in the original. Be careful about the ending though, it does change depending on the version you watch. Let's be honest, the only real reason this is as high as it is because it reminds me of Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost. Yeah, it's Mononoke Hime. And I say that because I don't like the English title. It loses some of the nuance. I think they should have translated it as Wolf Princess, or No Longer Human Princess, or something along those lines.
Because guess what? San's name is not Mononoke. That is a completely different thing. There's a lot to talk about with this one because it is probably the most nuanced and complex of Miyazaki's stories. But before that, let's talk about Hizaishi again. Because this time, Mononoke has possibly the best score of all time. And when I say this, I mean it is seriously in the top 3. I could put this music over anything and it would be epic and great and enthralling and brilliant.
朝ごはんを食べる
Back to the film itself, Mononoke is a film that has no real antagonist and really no real hero. Ashitaka is caught in the middle of a conflict, but he himself is no longer a person. He's simply a shadow, an outcast. He's not what he used to be, and he's just attempting to help the world live in harmony. San is also a character that has abandoned humanity, this time by deliberate choice, and now fights on the side of nature. Even Lady Eboshi and Jigo, the clear antagonists of the film, are not evil people by any means. Eboshi is arguably a hero in many ways, saving a handful of marginalized people, building a great city for people to live in, supplying work, and even providing a commodity that the people around need. Jigo is simply in it for the money, which makes him a less noble character, but by no means an evil person. There are plenty of people in the world who are greedy. Though it may be sinful desire, that does not make them bad people by virtue. Jigo even helps out characters throughout the film, proving that he's not the clear-cut villain. This is just one aspect of this really multi-layered film that demonstrates the gray areas of morality that the real world exists in, and setting up the idea for the overall thematic arc. The classic man versus nature. In this, however, nature is just as much as fault at man, making this gray area even wider. It is nature that curses Ashitaka, even if the anger of Nago was caused by human invention. Like most Miyazaki films, the idea to avoid war and to accept the beauty of the world around and not destroy it is a present idea. Soon there will be no world to live in, he cries. Film also draws upon a vast variety of influences, both Eastern and Western. The idea of respecting all life and multiple kami, of course, comes from Shinto, but despite these sentiments, the film feels much more similar to a Western fantasy like Lord of the Rings, or the poorly adapted Earthsea as previously mentioned. The whole idea and aesthetic of Irontown feels like something picked straight out of the Wheel of Time. But in the end, about as symbolically as you can possibly get, it is actually death, or a death spirit, that gives life back to the land. Everything is a circle, and despite all the evils committed throughout the film, there is a rebirth, and the circle restarts. All sins and evils can be forgiven, they can be overcome, but we have to admit that we were wrong. Well, that's my Ghibli ranking. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'd hope to hear from you if you have your own thoughts down in the comments. I also am still working on the state review videos. They take really long to edit, but they are coming out. Don't worry. Don't worry, they're coming. Anyways, thanks for watching.